Hi, everybody. This is Dave Artoso. We're so glad to be with you guys again. Wow, Brian Jensen. One more time, we've done another video about the temples of the old days of the Jewish faith, and it was their Christian temples, and we just did that, and hopefully you're seeing that. If you already saw it, if you haven't seen it, go check it out. It's a great video. But there's another video, since you and I are really connected more to the ancient faith, right? We have studied quite extensively. You taught. I'm teaching down at Dixie University about the first early Christians, the first 500 years. Brian taught a class there the past couple days about heresies and heretics. And, you know, I wanted to go and discuss this idea. When we were evangelicals, and we're not here to offend. There are those who are Protestants and evangelicals who might have more of a difficult time in wanting to watch this or agreeing with us, and we understand. We understand your positions with it, but we also understand that there are a lot of people who are interested in wanting to learn early Christianity and how it was all established.
And it's been amazing.
Yeah, it's important
to find 50, 60 people showing up at each of your classes.
Yes.
In a largely LDS dominant culture, who are really interested in being blown away by how much that they never learned before.
Exactly. So, because a lot of people start usually from their view of Christianity from the Reformation and going to, the 500 years that basically till 2019 that we're in. So a lot of people don't really understand the beginnings of early Christianity. And I think it's very important for all of us. I've said this many times before. We're Americans, and being Americans, we went to school and we were taught the history of America. And now people who believe in Jesus, we're Christians. We should really understand the history of Christianity. And I think it's vital for all of us. I mean, it's not something that we're trying to offend or hurt. We're just trying to really help people understand how this all came about.
Well, like when I was teaching your class, one thing that I started with was this idea of a map. Picture, what would you think of if I said, what is the Christian world, right?
Yeah.
And we showed an example of the map, which was largely, 14, 16 centuries of progression throughout the old Roman Empire.
Huge.
But the reality is like by 800 years after Christ, so roughly half of the timeline of that own map, Christianity had spread into China, into the as far east as Beijing, throughout India, throughout Persia, down into Africa, such that they saw the center of their world as in Jerusalem, and eastward, roughly 3 nodes of Asia, Africa, and Europa.
Huge.
But yet in the West, we largely think of Christian history in terms of Europa. And so when we begin to understand their worldview was really in an Eastern worldview that often we don't just naturally assume or are
Which
aware
extended
of.
A lot more with Christianity in the Eastern world compared to the Western world.
Right.
But we're from the West, and that's
so today's topic is going to relate exactly to that Eastern worldview.
Exactly. And so what we want to share, and we want to do this in a way to help you to prepare for this, because you have to ask these real questions no matter what. I mean, questions are important. When we were Mormon, we had to ask questions. A lot of times when you're Mormon, you don't want to ask questions because you're afraid to ask questions. But we're not afraid to ask questions. We want to keep learning and growing in Christ and growing in his faith and growing into the history of the church and everything. So we believe it's essential. So one of the things that I have been reading, this is a book right here. It's called The History of the Church, and it's by Eusebius, who is actually a bishop in Alexandria, because there were 5 sees, right, in the beginning, and those sees were the areas of Christianity, the centers of Christianity. If you look at the 5 sees, it was the Church of Rome, the Church of Alexandria, the Church of Jerusalem, the Church of Constantinople, and the Church of Antioch. Yeah, these are the biggest areas where Christians in the beginning were starting. And then there are also many Christians afterwards, and I mean, during that time.
I mean, all the major cities of the East, they had significant,
Syria.
Like at Edessa, they had a major university there. So as the Persian Empire re-arose and fought against the Roman Empire, the Christians were basically translating from Sanskrit such things as what we call now the Arabic numerals, which are actually Indian, and they were they were just infused in the whole culture of learning and Plato, aristocracy, Aristotle, and making sure that all of that was understood in the common language of Aramaic. And
a lot of crossover things.
A lot of crossover. They had a tremendous amount, and part of that was to recognize that the idea of the early church was significantly founded as an extension of the diaspora, which is we have belonging with God scattered throughout the world, and God will be made present with us by our faithful community. And so the idea of today's topic is this idea of what sometimes is called Apostolic Succession, which is based in the Roman, Greco-Roman, but even earlier than that, the idea that understanding comes down through a teacher who is given to a student who is then trusted to pass that on to others.
The faith of the fathers.
And that's not merely just Plato and Socrates, but that's even a Hebrew worldview. That is how we got the Hebrew scriptures, is because they were so disciplined in teaching how to even read the scriptures, because it was written in what we might say an alphabet, a symbology that contained no vowels. So if you were to be able to read what was written there and understand what was written there, that only came through oral tradition and oral teaching. You couldn't just pick it up and read it and interpret for yourself without having been taught by your teacher how to interpret that. And bishops. And the Christian church brings that same worldview in. How do we approach our holy texts?
Great.
I don't merely just pick them up and do my own thing, but I have to be taught through the apostles and those whom they instructed on how to preserve that.
And that's the question.
That is the question.
That's the question. Before we get engaged in that idea, what we wanted to share with you, this book is a great book. As a matter of fact, like I said, it was Eusebius. He was the Bishop of Alexandria in the time frame of like 300, the second century, pretty much, the 310, 320, somewhere in that. And he went on, and he was very determined for 25 years to study the history of the church, and he put it together here. So we have this. But there is an introduction that I actually have to introduce this to you and also to you. And the introduction says this: many of us in this land grew up in the conviction that the early Christians had very simple beliefs, the most primitive organizations, and an utmost complete lack of ceremonial. A study of Eusebius' pages will satisfy us that we have been greatly deceived. So that's just one comment. There are a lot of people who believe outside of the early Christian church that many people, when they first came to learn about Christ, they were just, there might be a disciple. He went out there to another town and he started teaching without any sort of governing body or hierarchy of the church, and he just kept going and doing this, and there are all these people say, I got to do this and this and this. That really wasn't the case. And he says right here, not only in his own statements, in Eusebius' statements, but in the testimonies of the earliest authorities on which he draws, we shall find inescapable proof that the church of the first generations of Christians was one in which any Christian of our own day would recognize most of the ideas and practices to which he is accustomed. I'm talking more of the Christians in the sense of like the Apostolic Church, anything that was an Apostolic Church. This is an introduction.
Yeah, when this was written, it was in the time of the early post-Reformation, when everybody had what we might call a high church experience. In other words, when you went to church, you did the liturgy, and the Eucharist was the central experience of that.
And this introduction he was an Anglican.
Yes.
So he referred it to that. Now, he also said that, we shall find the same line drawn between clergy and laity, which are the members of the church, the same division of the clergy into the three orders of bishops, presbyters, and deacons, the same practice of the episcopal ordination and consecration, the same insistence on the apostolic succession and on the establishment by Christ of the one holy Catholic and apostolic church. We shall find Christendom partition up into dioceses and archdioceses, presided over and ruled by bishops who are held in the highest esteem. And so this is like, for a lot of people, they're probably thinking, are you kidding me? This is how the church was really organized, with bishops, with deacons, with priests, with elders. And in reality, we're trying to say, yes, it was organized like that. And it's important. Now, you talked a little bit about this apostolic succession.
Yes.
Now, there's a lot of people who don't want to follow this or agree that there was an apostolic succession. Why? Because if they agreed or followed it, they would have to then question their position in being non-denominational, evangelical, Protestantism. Then they would have to actually question whether or not that if it failed or not, right? And so they have to do all these things.
There's a number of ways it can play out that have consequence, I think. But for me, I think one of the important things to take away from it is, do I see myself and my practice of my faith as an individual on an individual journey, seeking individual experiences, whether that's just, we define that as mystical or spiritual or whatever, or do we see ourselves as primarily as belonging to a community of right doctrine, doing right practices, and do we see those practices as needing to have a continuity to the old days of old? And the early church, this is one thing we talked about in our class the other day, is that the early church faces this divide very early within the late first century, and then especially in the second early century, we have what we might call the heresies. Now, that's a loaded word with a lot of modern baggage attached to it. But the basic idea is the Greek word from which it descends basically says that this is a personal choice, and the application of that choice often with the interpretation for sectarian purposes. So to back that off, how do we see that in the New Testament? Well, we see, for example, in 2 Peter, it says, we have these people rise who teach heresies, and they draw people away from a right understanding of who Christ is because they pull them into different directions. But then on another hand, we see Paul in 1 Corinthians, where he writes and he says, these heresies have arisen so that we can understand the continuity. In other words, when people break away and they form little segments and power things unto themselves, we can then look at those who don't do that, and then we understand how are they unified. And then also, I think in 1 Timothy 3:16 or 15:16, it talks about Paul illustrates the fact that the church is the pillar and ground of truth. Right. So he recognizes that, the establishment of the church was vital, it's important. It was not something that, you have a personal relationship and you go, just do individually what you want to do. It was a collection of a hierarchy that helped unify the church. Would you agree? Right. And one thing we want to clarify is that idea of apostolic succession doesn't mean that new apostles are ordained or intended to replace other apostles. There's always what we might call the small a apostle, which in the Greek simply means the sent one. And of course, the church always had people who are going out and planting churches and passing on the teachings of the apostles, and in a sense, they are like sent ones. So, for example, Paul will refer to his own co-missionaries, as they were. He refers them as apostles. So, for example, Timothy, who goes on to become a bishop at Ephesus, is called apostolic, but he was never an apostle, because the only people who were apostles were what are sometimes called the 12. And they are seen as establishing a foundation that doesn't need to be laid over and over again.
Exactly. It's not broken.
It's not broken. It's a sure foundation upon which the church raises and stands, with Jesus Christ as the chief cornerstone.
And so they're the pillars are us, and I also believe the apostolic doctrine and all the sacraments, everything that is from the apostles given to the bishops.
Right. I mean, we see that in the writings of Paul to Timothy and to Titus. Then the way that we see what I mentioned earlier, this idea of the teacher teaching the disciple and making sure that right practices and right teachings are passed on, and then asking them, demanding them, saying this is serious, take it very serious, that this be followed and broken, and these traditions aren't broken. And
and Paul says that, keep the traditions,
yes, exactly,
as I've given them to you. Yeah, exactly. So we're in a position now in 2019, many of us are like thinking, oh my gosh, I had no idea about this. Are you really saying that there really was an organized, a hierarchical sort of order of things with bishops following from the apostles to go to the bishops and the overseers of other churches, and the spread of Christianity throughout the Eastern world and so many countries and so many cities, that this was really happening? And you would say?
Yes.
Yes, and that's important.
Not only was it happening, but it was significant. You know, you have Philip, who goes among Samaria, and they plant churches all throughout Samaria. You have James, who's overseeing the church in Jerusalem, and then after the great Jewish-Roman War, they move up into what we would say modern-day southern Turkey or Syria, and they establish amazing powerful, influential cultural centers. And from there we have Thomas, for example, goes throughout Persia and into India and establishes churches. And it's just the world rapidly grew to see, why is it important that we see Jesus Christ as this Messiah? And then once they see that, how do we live out an actual community that's faithful? And the foundation of that is, it's not just one person saying, I've had this mystical experience. Because in the 2nd century, we have a number of people who do this, you know.
And they're heretics.
And sometimes, well, it's not just that we disagree with how they feel, right? It's not heresy in the modern connotation. It's heresy in the sense that not only are they deviating from the apostolic doctrine, but they're saying, I have the power to do this all on myself. And they form little sectarian movements who are intended to divide from others. And so we start seeing mystery religions rise, where women aren't allowed to participate, and it's only for the men. Or we start seeing things where they teach very divisive early practices. I mean, you want to dig into some crazy things, start reading the book of Irenaeus, which is called Against Heresies, written in the late 2nd century. He goes on to detail all these divides.
So what you're saying,
from small individuals, what they were trying to pull others away.
And this was happening, and this happens also now in many other, non-denominational churches. People who say, I want to start my own church, and then they start having a sort of this belief that they have, and they gather this information, and they don't have any apostolic sort of doctrine that they're following, but they have this belief that they go, hey, it's about, the Spirit telling me this, and then they start bringing people to this view that really is like a heresy in some ways, and it's
there's
pulling
always a
people
number of those
away.
where someone says, I read it and this is what it means to me, and we have some sort of denominational divide. The truth is there's often,
but those are like wolves, right, in sheep clothing.
Yes,
I mean they're trying to
there certainly
bring.
Have been and continue to be those kind of extreme movements, but sometimes there are people who are sincere, and divides happen because people have sincerity, and they're often trying to avoid mistakes of the past. But what does it often result in? It often results in us, rather than seeking for unity with one another, we seek to see all the divisions that divide us. And this is something that we see in early writings, such as Clement, for example, in the late 1st century. He's writing and saying, let us preserve what has been given to us to help preserve the unity of the faith. And so are we seeking out unity, or are we seeking out to follow movements unto ourselves?
And the truth itself too, as well. And if you don't have the actual apostolic truth, and one of those biggest truths is really the Eucharist, the real presence of Christ, to participate in that, and to take upon the divine in a way that many other churches after really they don't believe that way. It's more of a metaphor. It's more of a symbol. That's more of a remembrance. But it's not the same if you go in the Apostolic Fathers and you see the writings in the early hundreds. In 80s, you'll see it, and even the Didache, you'll see it, which is like a writing in the 60s, 60, 70 AD.
Yeah, some push it as late as the 80s, but certainly mid-late 1st century.
Which is like a catechism of description to help teach what the body should learn and know. Very powerful. Read this Didache if you have the chance. But there's so much information out there that to say that it didn't happen because we just have different views of it is not really being fair to the early Christian church. And that's why we wanted to share this.
One thing, just to harken back into the other video about temples, if you decide you want to go back and watch that, is the reason this is significant and how they overlap is because precisely that unity of the faith, because the body of the believers coming together in right practice and right teaching,
which is the Orthodox way,
and the reading of Scripture, is the idea that I belong to a community of the faithful. I'm never on my own.
Yeah.
And
it's physical.
And therefore,
it's not invisible.
It is the idea that the temple is a place that we come, and there's a constancy to that can be dependent on. I'm not blown by these winds that come through time.
Yeah,
and
beautiful.
So therefore, the idea of apostolic doctrine through this succession of trusting the bishops and the deacons and making sure right teaching is passed on,
and believing that the Holy Spirit is guiding the church.
Exactly. That's so powerful.
That's
to believe literally that through that God in the Spirit is alive in us and equipping us to carry out this constancy. Strikes at the very heart of the idea of temple and the idea of succession, of right teaching being preserved throughout time.
Yeah, beautiful. And we know also that there was ordinations, there were laying on of hands, this passing of authority, the priesthood, if you will, was continuing to be given. And we also know, if you look at the Roman Catholic Church, they also have this apostolic succession. But if you look at the Eastern churches, they do too.
Yeah, that's not just, it's just one thing by which to examine, because obviously differences and divides do emerge over the historical period. So how do we find constancy with that? That's a whole other video of itself.
Yeah.
But it's different than saying my expression in Jesus is merely my own thing. I can interpret rather than understanding how has the church received these things. Do I read them together with others, and do I seek out, is my first thing to seek out, how does the church understand what this means throughout time? Or do we just say, that's what it seems to me. I'm reading it in a language that's not even the original language, and if it just seems that way to me, therefore that's what it is. And that's okay, because it's just my own movement. We see in the early church that within, especially the 2nd century, many individuals purposely do that to do some significant harm in trying to break away from having a unity in the faith.
Yeah, Marcion
is a significant one.
So anyway, hopefully this helped you out. We were here to give you some insight, and it's up to you. You're the person, you're the Christian behind this, looking at us right now and saying, do they really have truth? Does it make sense? Is there some historical basis of what Bryan and I are trying to teach? We believe it is. I mean, it's not the fact that we don't. We go historically. This is not a feeling that we have. We don't go based on feelings anymore and to those levels, because a lot of people get really deceived by feelings, right? One person
feelings
feels
aren't enough. I'm not against feelings, but it can't be the only anchor by which we.
And if feelings are everything, then you get deceived, right? I always say A plus B equals what? The answer. So I think A should be the historical understanding, factual information, the feelings combined, then you get the answer, right? Makes sense. Well, God bless you guys. Hopefully, this has helped you, Bryan. There are a lot of people out there that really like your intellect and understand your understanding. Why don't you offer your email? If there's anybody out there who wants to email Bryan more, or maybe, they're saying, hey, I don't really know. Or if you want to email me, my email is dvbardo44@gmail.com, but why don't you share your email too as well?
It's my name at me.com, brianjensen@me.com.
At me?
me.com.
me.com. All right. Well, thanks so much for watching. God bless you guys. Have a great day. The Apostolic Succession, a big subject, and there's a lot more to it. But for the past 25, 30 minutes, you've been watching this, and I'm sure you're like, okay, this is very interesting. Is it truth or is it not? We know it's truth. But we know it's truth. Be a student.
Be a student of history, and there's a lot of great resources out there.
Amen. God bless you guys. Thanks for watching.